And there's sound.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it seems.
Good.
So this is Bee as the Bees, part. I am Ezra de Barcelona. There are a few pieces of front matter that I always like to get out of the way at the beginning of most expectations and scope. Expectations. This is not a practical class. I will not be able to teach you anything about how to keep bees. The research is drawn from documents ranging roughly from 1200 to 600. Geographically, we are looking as far west as Iberia, as far north as England, and as far south as northern Africa. Further research has to be done for any kind of agricultural stuff. I think my next step is going to be Asia. I might stop in Russia. Two things happening there. Mostly people saying not to sell there, despite the fact that Russians don't. We'll get into that later. A few acknowledgements I want to make. Foremost to Dr. Alexandra Sapojnik and her research team, Louise Mark Whalen. They are based out of King's College London. They have been working on this since 2019. This is mostly a compilation of several years. I bring this project to them. They've been working on it since 2019, thanks to funding from the Lever Home Trust. I can never remember which one it is. The grant will investigate the environmental, social, and economic impact in the Middle Ages in the interest of shedding further light on the relationship between education to provide information of relevant crisis regarding widespread colony collapse disorder. This lecture, the other is that this lecture is made possible by the JSTOR database and its parent organization. Their commitment to free and accessible research and education are what make it viable. Regarding handouts, this lecture doesn't have a handout for me to compile into a succinct, easily transported. Instead, I have a student registry. We'll sign at the end. Interested, please leave an email address. Provide you with a PDF of my research notes in a timely manner. I'll provide my email address. I actually forgot to do that in the first portion of fix that in post. I'll make sure to do it this time. And I'll provide you with the relevant PDFs. This is a 2-hour lecture at a collegium event. There's lots of stuff going on. You are the class, whatever you want. Just sign the registry on your way out if you'd be so kind. If you're online and you leave early, I'll never know. The structure for the class. So this morning, spent the first half of the lecture. That covered the supply side of the lecture. We talked about the production of agricultural products, the production. We talked about some of the social elements that surrounded it. Trade routes, how it was transported, and where it's being transported to. This session will be focused on the demand side of these economics. Talking about how were these products being consumed, who was consuming them, where, why were they being consumed in this way, et cetera, et cetera. We will break into roughly hour-long chunks. Discussing fundamental motivations that are driving some of the production and culture. And then in the second hour, we'll get more into the knit and the applications of honey and beeswax. Some specific examples from our documentation. And in between that, I'll be taking my voice, catching my breath, etc. So with that, at the end of the I started talking a little bit about regarding the trade of apicultural products. I discussed that amounts of honey were being transported from Barcelona to Alexandria on a basically constant. It's curious because Egypt is in the same basic climate as Barcelona. And we know they kept bees, and we know they produced a lot. So despite the fact that their domestic production was similar, they were still in quantities. We also have a fascinating travel log by a contemporary gentleman of, I compare it to Pliny the Elder quite often, insofar as this is very far off the mark in many ways, may have potentially been making a few. He's also a primary source. We have to run with it at least a little bit, at least it reveals or informs things regarding other studies. It tells us that Islamic beekeepers in Morocco early would have been harvesting their hives, collecting honey, and then leaving it where it fell. He claimed, paraphrase, that this was because of the value of it. Because our traveler was a Christian, and he placed very different value on the beeswax. And started on for this portion of the lecture. And we'll reveal the mystery of why so much honey and why Christians seem to care so much about beeswax. I will begin by asking if there is anyone present who is a Catholic. Not so. I will explain that Catholic religious practice involves a lot of candles, and that's not simply an aesthetic direct pretty. It is a doctrinal decision. It is part of their religious observance. The priest is delivering the mass. He must have candles, flame candles. Theological reasons for this that are outside the scope of this lecture. These candles specifically must be made out of. Now, in our modern day, the rule is they have to be beeswax or more. I don't know when that rule came into. There are a number of pollutants that you can mix into a beeswax. 6 inches of beeswax into 12 inches of candle. You could mix paraffin or oils, all sorts of things. Our period, I feel relatively confident that it was going. I don't think that they were going to be mixing pollutants in with the. Part of that is the fact that their options were more limited. Today we have soy wax and coconut wax and any wax that. And we have paraffin, which is a petroleum byproduct. Candle that you burn today, if it's not explicitly advertised or labeled beeswax or soy wax or something else, it's made out of paraffin. Paraffin is plentiful, it's fine. In our period, burning stuff for light were much more limited. The option available was tallow, a form of animal fat. I believe it's specifically either cattle or sheep that has been collected from a carcass. So you've slaughtered the animal, you've collected the fat, down into a more pure form. So you've melted it down and rendered all the other stuff that might be on there. So you have a very, very pure. Now, tallow is very plentiful because you get it anytime you slaughter an animal. There are a few problems with tallow. For one thing, it does not burn a very orange, very dim light. Very filthy. It is not an efficient combustion process. Most of the combustion process is giving off ash rather than flame. Getting a dimmer light, you're also producing a lot of smoke. It's filthy. And perhaps most damning for immediate concerns, reeks. If you have ever burnt baked steak on for too long, you have an idea of what burning tallow is. Literally burnt grease. It's extremely unpleasant. It's the only real option if you're not rich in the Middle Ages. Unless you're graphically lucky. Because tallow takes the place as the most common lighting source when the empire recedes. The reason for this is that as the Roman Empire, important things happen. One, it takes control of North Africa. It has vast acreage of agricultural land. North Africa, if you know a little about antiquity, you know that North Africa, this was what was producing the grains that fed the Roman legion. It was also where the olive plantations were kept. Plantations produced the tons and tons of olives that the empire needed, and pressed the olive oil that was all important, not only for cuisine, but the most common form of lighting if you were in Italy or North Europe, olive oil lamps. And as the empire expands north, Roman citizens, you have magistrates, legionnaires, officials, etc., and for olive oil because it's a home comfort. They're Romans or they are of olive oil for their lamps. In the exact same way that we as Americans would want electricity. As the Imperium recedes, however, not only do you have the retreat out of Britannia, away from Gallia, where you no longer have those Roman citizen culture that creates the demand for olive oil up here, you also lose North. You don't have access to the olives anymore. I like to like a heart pumping olive oil up to Northern Europe. And as the Imperium recedes, us pumping. Not only do you not have people up here that want it and will, don't have people down here that are making it for their sake. So Northern Europe and becomes the sole domain of what will become the Darwin. So you're left with tallow up here. You have many, or access to beehives. And now you have a source of light available to you in the form of beeswax. Beeswax creates a very bright, very cool colored flame. It burns slowly. This was something that I learned at Penzing. It was explained to me that tallow actually burns very, very quickly. Beeswax. I burn beeswax candles at home. 8 inches of a beeswax taper candle will last me 6 hours, almost an hour per inch. Pillar candles will definitely last you an hour per inch. So it burns slower. You get more light over time. And it also burns cleaner, there's less off, and it burns more pleasantly. The aroma that bees burn is actually quite nice. You know, it doesn't smell like artificially scented candle. It's much nicer to smell than tallow, especially. Beeswax is overall the superior choice for lighting. It's just also more expensive. You only get 1 pound of beeswax per hive per harvest. Of prioritization that happens regarding who gets to burn it, and namely by that. Now, I should be clear, there are other regarding beeswax. Beeswax is also used, obviously, for. So any one of the literati, the literate classes, would have been using or missives, would have been using it to affix their stamp onto important documents. It was used for one of the main methods, if you didn't have pitch to waterproof, thing that pitch wouldn't work well with, that you would treat it with bees. Obviously, you could use it for fabric, for sewing. To this day, you know, we give cakes of beeswax or buy cakes of beeswax to run. Makes it a bit stiffer, a bit stronger, helps it stand up to wear and tear better. So there are a lot of reasons for using beeswax. The Catholic Church, theologically speaking, isn't interested. Private use, government use, noble use, that's all really cool stuff. But the church is far and away the biggest consumer of bees. And okay, cynically, skeptically speaking, it probably had a lot to do with I gave good light, etc. But there's actually an even deeper reason for the church's interest in beeswax candles specifically. One of my favorite parts of the lecture. Let us know we are natural philosophers of the medieval world. We are educated, we can read and write, we have at least a working knowledge of Plato, and we're wandering about the world being very intelligent and making our livelihood. Given enough time and enough natural philosophers, it is that one of them would eventually look at a beehive and go, so they, by whatever means, take a big stick, open, and go to take a look inside, and then proceed to die from bee stings. Which means the next natural philosopher will have learned an important lesson. And when he tries the same thing, we'll have some form of protection. So he cracks open the hive and looks within. And the bees are stinging at him, but he's protected, it's all right. And he goes, all right, so here's what I see. I see honeycomb, it's all very orderly and pleasant to look at. It's all these, you know, perfect hexagonal shapes and whatnot. And there's the honey, there's bees, there's the king bee. They were only identified as queens in 1806, when we finally had the optics necessary to zoom in and see the ovaries. That was something I learned at Penzic. Up until then, we just knew that they were large bees that everyone followed. So I see the king bee, and I look around some more, and I see something weird. I see eggs, those look like eggs there. But then over here, it's maggots? Can't be right. I mean, we know where maggots come from. They are spontaneously generated. Rotten meat and foul owners will simply congeal into maggots, and they grow up into flies. But there's no rotten meat or foul odors within here. It's all very beautiful and heavenly and whatnot. You're all catching on a lot faster than most people do. And they go, all right, so they're not maggots, they're not spontaneously generated. There's eggs, something's laying, these are babies. Well, we know what it looks like when cows make babies, and when dogs make babies, and when people make babies. But we don't see any tangoing happening in a beehive. No matter how closely we look, we've never caught bees making the beast with two backs. So there are babies, but no sex. Where have I heard this one before? This is an act of immaculate conception. Bees are understood by medieval natural philosophers to be Marian in nature. They are Christ-like. They are virgin-born and give birth as virgins. They are heavenly creatures. They are sacred. You will literally see, and I've actually had people at Penzek who've already seen this because they'd seen the visual representations. One of them had seen the poetic language being used. You will see Jesus the Christ being referred to as Apis Ethera, the heavenly bee. And you will see visually, when you see visual depictions of Jesus the Christ, you will see bees, or you will actually even see bee iconography standing in for Jesus. This is why it's important to understand this, because if you're trying to engage with medieval art and you don't know that visual shorthand, if you're not familiar with that visual language, you're going to miss something really important, which is that if there are bees here, the artist isn't just incorporating bees. The artist is invoking the imagery of Christ. And that changes how we analyze artistic representation. So bees are Christ-like. They're associated with Jesus, with Mary. And it just so happens that they make wax that you can burn, and it smells nice, and it gives off a very bright light. So it's kind of impossible to not use the beeswax candles. You know, if your savior, if the Son of God has, you know, little insect versions of himself running around and they make something you can make candles out of, you kind of have to incorporate it, right? So this is an element of my overarching thesis for this lecture and for this research, which is that we in the SCA don't think about bees enough. We think about a whole lot of things. We think about garb, we think about music and travel, we think about work. We don't think about bees. They have gone completely under our radar. We have truly had no appreciation for the extent to which apiculture shaped and influenced medieval life. I talked in the first portion of the lecture about how most apicultural production was happening on small holdings. This was not something that 1 in a million people participated in. If you weren't keeping hives, you knew someone who was. And if you didn't know someone who was, then someone in your community was, and you just didn't know them yet. We have records of people literally leaving not just chunks of wax in their will for the church, but entire hives for the church. We have records of people leaving cattle behind, bequeathing them to their local parish on the stipulation that any proceeds from the cattle's dairy or eventual meat is to go toward purchasing wax for the church. This was a whole thing. People wrote their wills to provide wax for their local parish, sometimes with the explicit intent of receiving absolution for their sins in exchange. This was a spiritual act. This could get you into heaven, was getting wax to your parish. This is true at least in England. We have a lot of documentation for that in England. I'm fairly confident that you'll see it in other parts of Christendom, but that's where my documentation is. So the church has a massive hunger for wax. There's a bastion of Christendom further east that has a hunger for honey as well, but I'll touch on them in a little bit. I need to lubricate a little bit. So I'll touch on Christian interest in honey specifically in a little bit. But first, I want to fill out the other half of the equation here by talking about Islam a bit more. So I mentioned how North Africa makes a lot of honey. They are described as throwing wax on the ground, but they're importing even more honey. Muslims provide a very awkward convenience for Christians, and Christians provide a very awkward convenience for Muslims. Because if you're the Catholic Church in Europe, you have a dire need for wax. Problem: the Catholic Church encompasses effectively all of Europe. So everywhere in Europe is already putting almost all of its wax production towards its existing demand for wax. So Spain can't turn to France hoping that it's got some extra wax to spare. We're already firing on all. You need more wax. Where can we go where they make a lot of wax, but they don't want the wax? The Muslims have a lot of wax because they make a lot of honey. But they're not going to give it to us for free. So what can we give the Muslims that they need more of that we don't need at all? It's not going to make sense to you why the answer is honey, unless you know a somewhat obscure piece of information about Islam. It's here for us in the West. It's pretty well known among Muslims. This is what I would describe as a cultural factor rather than religious, for reasons that I will get into shortly. But obviously, in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, the last prophet sent, blessed by God, is a substantial figure. He delivers the truth of God. He's the last prophet. He issues the last proclamations of heaven to earth, and he engages in virtuous and enviable behavior. He kind of sets the tone for what a good Muslim looks like, because he's the last prophet. Clearly, there's something worthwhile in him. God chose him for that role. So a lot of Islamic culture, I will say, as opposed to religion, revolves around emulating Muhammad. And I say culture as opposed to religion because it's not really stemming from any religious scripture. It's not like Muhammad sat down and wrote, be like me in every way. But it just so happens that the Prophet Muhammad had a marked appreciation for sweet treats. And his favorite treat of all was honey. So it's not like he sat down and wrote in the Quran, "Thou shalt eateth honey with all thy meals." But he was known to be a fan of honey, and it became a cultural element of Islam to put honey in everything, basically. There's another thing going on which has to do with Islamic virtues, namely the virtue of magnanimity. If you were wealthy, then it was expected that your ethical behavior would include throwing lavish parties. This was kind of a middle way, wasn't quite charity, it wasn't quite pride, but in Christian understanding, that's kind of the middle point between it, where you were supposed to host these lavish parties where you spend all of this money to have these massive feasts and all these decadent meals and whatnot for two reasons, personal and a social one. The social one was that it uplifted your community.
because it meant that not only were the poor people in your city eating, they were eating well. It's not just that they had food in their stomach, but they had meat and honey and wine and fruits and berries and whatnot. And that was a social good. The personal reason was that you were supposed to bask in your success. You weren't supposed to boast. You weren't supposed to be, arrogant about it. But if you had been blessed with success, if you had conducted yourself well, then the righteous and ethical thing to do was to enjoy it, to make use of it. You see kind of the prototypical ideal here with Sinbad, I think it is, the great merchant adventurer, where in the very beginning of the story, our protagonist, our narrator, comes into the palace complex and talks about how, it's like the Garden of Eden renewed on Earth, and there's music and wine and honey and fruits and berries and meat, and everything is wonderful and beautiful. And, this is all because of Sinbad's adventures. This whole story is Sinbad going on his adventures and earning his fortune, and now he's done it. He has become wealthy, he's made his fortune, and now he may, bask in his success and, patronize artists and staffers and whatnot, and uplift his community and enjoy the fruits of his labor. So it's a little bit of a different ethical mindset than we in the West are used to because of the Christian influence on our philosophical thinking. But there was an element where in Islam, if you were wealthy, that wasn't a bad thing, so long as you were putting it to use. Put it to use, enjoy the fruits of your labor, and therefore they had a lot of very lavish parties, which featured hundreds, if not thousands, of gallons of honey. That's part of where the demand for honey comes from in Islam, is the cultural element of magnanimity and Muhammad's penchant for honey. There are other things driving demand. Honey is used medicinally. That drives demand across North Africa and Europe. Honey is applied as a medicinal salve or medicinal meal. We have records of Teutonic forts in Eastern Europe. Their inventory records, their stock, show them acquiring massive amounts of honey in irregular intervals. And there's something intriguing about that because it suggests that the honey is not being used for victuals. There's a few reasons why we can tell that it's not being used for victuals or rations. One, honey is very hard to move. If you want to move a substantial amount of it, you need large barrels, it's heavy, it's a liquid. If it crystallizes, that's fine, but it's not going, it's crystallized now. It'll keep, but it's still heavy. But, if the barrel turns over in the wagon and it's still liquid honey, then you've just lost at least half your honey. So it's not good for armies on the march. It does keep, and that is one reason why you might keep it for military rations. But the nail in the coffin is the acquisition pattern. How frequently do you go to the grocery store? Weekly? Every other weekly? Certainly not twice a year. And you certainly don't go and buy 2 tons of food while you're at the grocery store. You acquire what you're going to be using in the next period of time, and you whittle that down over time, and you pick up some more to replace that. Even if you're on a, yes?
If you're living in a seasonal world, though, you would harvest things in season.
Well, yes, but I'm
Okay.
I'm
Sorry.
using metaphor here.
Okay.
Because it's not that they harvested, because it's irregular. That's the thing. It's not that they suddenly restocked with a few tons of honey coinciding with the harvest. It's that they would go 5 years and then suddenly be buying 10 tons of honey, and then 2 years and buying 3 tons of honey. That's what I mean by irregular. In the very literal sense of it's not following any particular pattern. So it's not that they buy a lot of honey and they're eating the honey and their supply is getting whittled down and then they top back up. We're pretty sure, because the dates line up a little bit, that the honey wasn't being used for food, it was being used as medicine. Because what would happen is there would be some big battle, and you would go rush to the fort and get all the honey out, and you would slap it on the wounds and feed it orally, and now you've gone through a lot of honey. And now you have to get a lot of honey back. But battles don't happen on a regular basis. It's not like we all get together for our biannual slaughter. There is war season, but we should employ more honey for war season. I think that in addition to water bearers, I think we should have honey bearers.
Yeah.
So we're fairly certain that when you see military installations in the Middle Ages, they probably have honey and they're probably not eating it. If they are, they're consuming it as a mead. I'll get to that in a short minute. So honey is medicinally applied. So that's part of the drive for demand. That's part of what's getting people to buy it up. That's part of what makes it move around. It's also just tasty. It's a class symbol, actually. I should be more specific. If I am in Poland and I'm eating Polish honey, that is because I am, at best, middle-class Polish. Because I can afford to buy honey, I'm only buying Polish honey. If I'm in Poland and I'm eating Catalonian honey, that means I'm rich. Filthy, stinking rich. I have enough money that I can buy the best honey in Europe. East European honey is considered subpar. We're not completely sure why. We suspect it's because East Europe is more comprised of pine forests, and the pine would have left a more bitter taste in the honey, would have rendered it more viscous. Catalonian honey was considered the gold standard. It was harvested frequently. Now, I concede that it's possible that the reason Catalonian honey was considered the gold standard was not just because of the high quality, but also because it made up a substantial part of the market. So it wasn't just good honey, but it was honey that was readily available. That's not to say it was cheap. It wasn't. It was one of the most expensive honeys you could buy. It's just that you could always buy it. So we have a lot of motivations for demand. Beeswax has a lot of uses. Honey has a lot of uses. Europe has a chronic shortage of wax. I shouldn't say that. Not a chronic shortage of wax. We actually very rarely see wax shortages. It has a constant hunger for wax. If there were a disruption of the wax supply, the shortage would come very quickly because of the sheer amount of consumption happening. I explained in the in the previous session, England, Dr. Sapojnik makes some calculations using some fair enough numbers. She establishes the bare minimum for church use. Basically 3 candles, 2 on the side of the priest and the root light, the foot of the statue of Mary or Jesus. And she calculates, we have a fairly middle of the road parish here. We have their records for how much wax they were using. So if we figure that something smaller than that parish, something the size of that parish, something larger than that parish, And then the 10 largest institutions.
Talking about bees,
Yes, we are.
I'm in the right place.
Excellent. Watch out for the clouds behind me.
So we, what was I just saying?
England.
Calculations. Thank you. So if we assume smallest, medium, largest, absolute largest use, X% less or more than this parish, and we run all those numbers out, Dr. Sapochnik's estimations for the annual national consumption of wax for parish usage only in England was about 148,000 pounds, which is substantial when you realize that you only get about a pound of wax from a hive per harvest. She estimates that it's probably closer to 300,000 for regular usage. I feel like she's shortfalling a little bit. I think that she's lowballing things. I might say that it's more like 400,000, but she has a doctorate and I don't, so take that as you will. So that's England. That's the wee tiny little backwater island country that not a lot of people really wanted to care about. Think about Spain. Think about France. Think about Italy. I mean, that gives you a notion. We're talking about millions of pounds of wax, if not tens of millions per year, constantly. When I call it a ravenous appetite, it's exactly what it is. North Africa is the release on that pressure. You actually have, fascinatingly enough, you have letters preserved today of Muslims that were writing into their imams, their sages and wise men, asking, is it permissible for me to sell wax to a Christian? Because they knew, they had the understanding of what the Christians were using the beeswax for, which was for religious worship, and therefore, does selling wax to a Christian constitute, subsidizing heresy and heathenry? To which the imam said, yeah, it does. Don't do that. Just make sure that you sell to someone that you know will not sell it to Christians. This was massively ignored. I can't even begin to tell you the scale to which no one paid attention to this. This does actually bring up an important point about the way that historical events tend to knock on. And I'm going to apologize because this is going to take something of a dark turn. In 1392, the city of Valencia in modern-day Spain had a massive pogrom. The city had 2,500 Jews living within its limits. About 200 of them made it into the city's garrison and were safe by the time that the gates fell down. All of the others were either killed or forcibly converted. This was on the larger scale of a pogrom in terms of absolute damage done, but far from unprecedented. So now you have several problems going on in Valencia. You have a number of forcibly converted Jews. Now here's the problem with that. Once a Jew is converted to Christianity, they're not allowed to convert back because now that's apostasy, which is a high crime. So under no circumstances can there be any indication that they are observing Judaism, that they have relapsed away from Catholicism. The responsibility for making sure that they don't relapse falls on the local king. And the local king, who I believe is James, right at that point, is in a bit of a bind because he really liked having those Jews in his kingdom because they were very useful for financial and commercial reasons. So he emphatically cannot allow them to be Jews again because that's going to open them up super hard for a massive excommunication. I mean, he also does not want them to not be Jews because that is going to hurt his treasury and economy. So there's kind of this awkward unspoken arrangement that happens where the conversos in Valencia start applying for and receiving permission to hop the pond to do business in Morocco because they have cousins, brothers, family-in-law that live over the pond doing their own, commercial stuff. And being permitted to do that, and they just never come back. And they just go right back to being practicing Jews, basically in a state of de facto exile. And all the while, the priesthood is basically saying, Your Majesty, you have to make sure that these Jews don't escape. And he's like, yeah, no, guys, don't go to Morocco and help establish a very strong and profitable trade route between Valencia and Morocco. Definitely don't take these passports and do exactly that. So we're pretty sure that there was kind of a mutually beneficial arrangement going on between the crown and the conversos, where they could basically swap out forced conversion for exile if they were so interested. And this establishes a large expatriate community in Morocco and Northwest Africa, which serves as the middleman between Western Islam and Western Christianity. They are literally they are the ones because they have these business connections with the unconverted Jews of Valencia, where they can arrange the business transactions, and amongst those business transactions were honey and wax exchanges. They weren't literally exchanges, but that was the de facto result. So that's how you end up with a pogrom in Valencia leading to a converso expatriate community in Morocco building a trade network.
Correct, the Imams really didn't care about selling rights to Jews.
No.
Because Jews weren't using them.
Well, because the Jews were not using them for worship.
Yeah.
But you could sell to a Jew as long as you trusted that they would not sell to a Christian. Oh, yeah. It's no problem. But of course, we're also seeing, we have tens of thousands of liters of honey coming from Barcelona to Alexandria. And I think it's telling that those ships go back to Barcelona full of wax. Like I said, I cannot emphasize enough the degree to which people did not care about the religious injunction not to provide Christians with wax. We do also have indications that selling honey to trade between the religions was always, technically speaking, impermissible, right? Like there's always kind of sort of been religious rules on the books saying, you shouldn't, you shouldn't help to bring wealth to the infidel or whatnot, and you shouldn't suffer them or whatever. And obviously, the nobility and the merchant class really didn't care because they. Up north, they really wanted their wax and their dates and honey and whatnot. And down south, they wanted their various northern goods. We actually have an interesting record. This will help me shift into mead a little bit. This will be about all I say about mead because my research is mostly on the primary products of agriculture. But we have some interesting things happening with mead, which is mainly that in this time period and in this geography, people aren't really drinking a lot of it. You don't see a lot of it except in religious communities. You do see monasteries producing mead both to sell and for their own consumption. And you see a bunch of other honey-based fermentations like thelins and whatnot. There's one convent in Spain that was known for its production of honey wines that they would gift to local lords and whatnot. But it's out east that things get interesting because the Knights Teutonica, they got a thing about mead. There's a letter that we have from the Grand Master of the Teutonic Orders sent to the Grand Prince of Lithuania, basically saying, amongst other diplomatic overtures, stop asking us to send you honey, because we need it to make mead. And we're not going to drink water, so we need to have mead. The Teutonic Knights are very fascinating. They actually add another motivation for demand here. Because the Teutonic Knights not only take their tax payments from their local serfs and peasants in the form of honey, they pay their mercenaries in the stuff. If you had served out a mercenary contract for the Teutonic Knights, one of the ways that they would square up with you was by loading you up with a wagon full of barrels of honey. It was quite literally, in economics, sometimes people will glibly say that money is whatever the government takes in taxes. In that sense, honey was a form of currency. Anywhere where the Teutonic Knights were the tax collecting power. And you could get paid in it. You also have the knights fixated on mead. You see them making it by the ton. And the reason for that is that the Teutonic Knights specifically draw a lot of their cultural narrative from the Knights of the Round Table, and specifically from Sir Parsifal. And Parsifal, when he's depicted, is drinking mead. So there is a sense of lineage of we draw our charter from Sir Parsifal of the Round Table, and Parsifal drinks mead, so we drink mead. Further south, there's kind of a weird phenomenon that happens because we don't have a lot of records talking about honey wines in the Islamic world, but they had a lot of honey, and where there's fermentable anything, there's fermented drinks. But the biggest indication of the association between honey and alcohol, which, remember, I had this pointed out at Penzig, Islam forbids alcoholic consumption as a rule. What's that?
Except as medicinal use.
Except as medicinal use, and also that assume that you care. Yes. There is a reason why there are we have depictions of fountains of wine as depictions of wealth in the southern world. But you do have one caliph, I think it was Al-Hakim, who issues a fatwa. He sets out a specific prohibition against alcohol. He's one of the caliphs that's cracking down on it. And he specifically lists honey in the prohibition. Not mead or any other fermented beverage. He specifically says honey. There's ways to interpret that. He may have been referring to honey as a fermented beverage in whatever form it may take in an effort to avoid being like, well, you can't drink mead. Oh, we're drinking the fig limb. All right, you can't drink anything made from honey. He might have been trying to, I doubt it, of course, it may have been literal where he wanted to outlaw honey. He didn't get far at all, if that was the case. But we have a recognition of mead and honey-based alcohols, their consumption and their usage throughout this area.
Sorry to interrupt, but if the Templars were taking taxes in honey,
The Teutonics.
the Teutonics, I'm sorry. Do we have evidence of adulteration of honey?
Yes, we do. I touched on it a bit in the first portion of the lecture, but I'll cover it again here a little bit. We have extensive records of regulation for honey. We have extensive records of criminal proceedings against fraud pertaining to honey. We have indications that honey was very finely graded in the sense that I compare it to wine. You had honey sommeliers who could take a taste of a honey and tell you, how pure it was, what region it came from, what herbs it was based on, et cetera, et cetera. We do have records of people cooking the books, as it were, mixing their fine honey with their less fine honey. We have records. I don't think it had anything specifically indicating anything like watering down or anything. But we do know that if you were caught committing fraud with honey, I can speak for Portugal at least with certainty. I don't think I have documentation for anything in the East. But I know that in Portugal, if you were caught defrauding honey, then you'd end up with a major fine in silver. And more serious offenses could result in maiming. You would lose a hand as punishment for your crime. I'm not getting into the Zablers because they don't answer your question, but suffice to say, there's a very wonderful organization in Central Europe that is more concerned with regulation of honey production. Their interest is in the protection of beehives and preventing interference with honey and wax production. I recommend that you watch the first part of the lecture on YouTube when it comes out because I get into it then. So I've discussed the religious and cultural motivations. I've discussed mead a little bit. We've discussed the scope of consumption. We're actually just past the hour now, so I think I'm going to take this opportunity to rest my voice and hydrate a bit, take 5 minutes. And when we get back, I will go into a little bit more detail. I'll bring up some specific names and places, and we'll get a bit more nitty and gritty, if you will. So, take 5. Feel free to speak amongst yourselves.
Yes. And I can't really shut off the live stream, but it can be edited out in post-production.
That's no problem. Okay, home stretch for me. I taught an extended version of this course at Penzic. I taught it organized by region, Mediterranean, Central Europe, and North Europe. Each of those classes was about 2 hours long. I taught the lecture twice. I gave 11 hours of lecturing at Penzic. So, this is going to kind of be the facts and figures portion, if you will. A little bit of errata, a little bit of where I get to catch up on a few things I didn't mention throughout the rest of the lecture, and a few names and figures that have come up in my research to get the sense of scale, sense of scope, and just a little bit more detail and texture. So I'd like to begin with a few things in England, because this will help round out a few things regarding consumption. Because in England, you have more than just cathedrals that are taking up wax. You also have universities. We actually have records of gentlemen who set up shop in towns like Cambridge and Oxford, specifically to sell wax to the university students. Because if you were studying at the university, you were staying up past dark. We have some interesting patterns that emerge there, because what we find is the universities don't buy the cheapest wax. There are wax merchants that are selling in port towns that are eminently accessible to university towns, and they're selling wax that's significantly cheaper than the wax that's available in the local retailers up in the college towns. And we're fairly sure the explanation that we've come up with up to this point is that the motivating factor, and this is the thing about economics, right? Economics predicates itself on the idea that humans, behave according to certain, what you might call rational parameters, right? They will pursue the most benefit for the least risk and whatnot. But sometimes what is rational is not known to us. And sometimes humans just engage in what you might also call irrational action. And in this particular case, it's the best we can understand it is that the universities were not interested in getting a good deal. They were interested in convenience. Because what those retailers in the college towns provided was not a good deal, but it was right freaking there. There may have been an interest on the parts of the university. The cathedrals, the Barcelona Cathedral, which I'll get into in a minute, puts quite a lot of effort into acquiring wax. We actually will see the Barcelona Cathedral sends clerks out in like 100-mile radius of the city of Barcelona, picking up ounces of wax from smallholders all around the countryside. It's possible that the universities did not want to put that much effort into it. It's possible that they did not have the manpower or the resources available to be sending people out to the ports or to patrol the countryside, gathering wax for them. It may also be possible that it was kind of a relationship thing, where the universities had relationships with these wax sellers, as well as with the local chandlers. So everything was just kind of an established, process, right? We pay the waxer, sends it to the chandler, who makes the candles, who brings it to us, and then we have it for the students and the professors.
So the university was buying institutionally.
Effectively. Which is actually somewhat similar to what we see with the Cathedral of Barcelona. The Cathedral of Barcelona is, pardon the expression, Byzantine in its bureaucracy. It has a wide variety of bureaucratic departments and subdivisions, sometimes with exceptionally niche tasks. And each of them effectively operate as an autonomous organization under the cathedral's umbrella. The one that's most relevant to us right now is the Humanaria de los Precios Jesucristo, or the Illuminators of the Holy Body of Jesus Christ. And their entire task, the entire purpose of that department of the cathedral was to acquire candles for the Corpus Christi celebration. That was their entire job. And it was a full-time job. I think it's an excellent case study in how far we have come as a species in labor-saving technology regarding things like logistics. Because even though it was a very niche job of just acquiring one thing for one holiday, it actually took that much dedicated effort. Because you had to send people out to acquire wax in bits and pieces over the course of the year so that you had enough, not only enough wax, but enough time for the chandler to make the wax into candles. What makes it similar to the university towns in England is that we have the cathedral purchasing from different suppliers of wax. They actually institutionalized their chandling service. They actually set up a chandling workshop in the sub-levels of the cathedral. So literally setting it up in the basement, where they'll bring the wax in from around the city, gather it all, they'll buy it from the port, have porters bring it up from the port to the cathedral, and down into the workshop, where they would have an in-house full-time chandling team working on processing the wax into actual candles. So the cathedral bought its wax piecemeal, but once it had the wax, the channeling service itself was institutional and very centralized. And that's something that we seem to be seeing as a pattern across a lot of Europe. At least I haven't spoken on the actual channeling process, because that's just an inch outside of the focus of the research. But we're mostly seeing that somewhat similar to agriculture, Wheat is a wonderful crop. The problem is you need a lot of infrastructure to process it. You need a mill. And mills are great choke points for bureaucratic control. There is a reason why medieval literature, if it's looking for a shorthand way to tell you that a character is skeevy, underhanded, shady, sinful, corrupt, they're always a miller. Because the miller, everyone brought their wheat into the miller, and the miller could basically do whatever the hell they wanted with it from there. There was nothing you could really do to stop them. So fair or not, there was a lot of accusations of adultering of people. You would bring in 10 pounds of wheat and you would be entitled to 10 pounds of flour once it was all processed. But, the miller would take his cut. And of course, the local government, lordship or burghers or what have you would take their cut, because in many cases it was technically their mill. The miller was just the one running it. As a bit of a side note, there's actually a bit of a theory that parts of what sows the seeds for the revolutionary liberalizing movements of Europe in the 17 and 1800s is the potato, because it didn't get milled. Potatoes are extremely easy to grow. They create a lot of produce for your effort, and they require no further processing. You can grow your own potatoes on your own plot of land, even if you're renting. You can grow a lot of them, and you can get a lot of calories for very little effort, and there's no choke point where any middleman or overlord can take their cut out from it or bar you from access. So there's suddenly not only this nutritional changing of the scales, where now you have easier access to calories, which has always been the great struggle of every species on Earth, is the battle against caloric deficit. So not only have you won a major fight in that war, but you've also slipped the yoke out from under some of the established means of control. Obviously, the potato did not literally inspire people to chop off the heads of King Louis or whatever, but it made it possible to consider that, or more possible anyway. But just the same, we see chandlers as a choke point for processing wax. You can gather your wax, but if you want to actually make candle on a large scale, you need a workshop. Even on a small scale, you need some kind of dedicated tools for it. You also need, and this is something that slips under everyone's radar because they never think about it, you need wicks. So the wax alone isn't enough. You also need, your fabric of choice, linen, cotton, wool, whatever. You need to make wicks. So chandler workshops were also a centralized place. It would have been a dedicated trade with guilds, and that would have earned you a middle class lifestyle. Let's see. There were some more facts here I wanted to get into. One of the primary sources that Dr. Sapojnik draws from for her research regarding wax in Catalonia is the Viuda Real y de Mediona, which is the tax of royalty and the Mediona family. What that basically was, up until about the 1200s, there was the royal tax and there was the noble tax, basically. The House of Mediona levied its noble tax on certain goods passing through Barcelona, as well as the crown levying its own tax. In the 1200s, the crown and the local nobility reached an agreement where they're like, all right, we're just going to apply one tax at the point of exchange and then split up the pool of money later. But it's really complicated because, as pertains to wax, the tax was 2 shillings and 8 pence per carrega, which is equivalent to 128 kilograms, which if my conversion holds, that should be something like 60 pounds. If it's less than half of a carrega, then all of the money goes to the Mediona, the noble family. If it's more than that, then a third of it goes to Mediona and 2/3 of it goes to the crown. So while you have a single pool of money, the actual counting of how much money goes to which party is established entry by entry. This was collected by neither the nobility nor the royalty, but by the church, who is the third party to all of this. There is another department of the cathedral called the Via Almoina. Their entire job is to collect the tax. But what I find really cool about this is that the tax and the institutions surrounding it, they last until the liberal revolution in the 19th century. This is a 600 to 800-year-old tax that remained in place on an institutional level until literally the destruction of the monarchy that authorized it. I found that very interesting, only because you don't see things last that long, especially on an institutional level. Let's see. I mentioned a little bit in the last lecture, there's some kind of weird trade thing happening with Russia. We have government authorities in the Baltic states and in Eastern Europe that are selling to merchants, selling honey and wax to merchants, except they have this rider on the sales contracts basically saying you can buy, but you can't sell to Russians. Now, that's not an unprecedented rider. We actually see that in a lot of places. You can't sell in Denmark, you can't sell in this principality or that one. But Russia gets targeted a lot, and it's weird and interesting because of the fact that we have a letter from a merchant posted up in Russia, sent to his partner out west, saying, please stop sending me honey, no one's buying it here. So there's a little bit of a nature in their palate. They don't care about it. But I don't know why the neighboring powers seem so invested in freezing Russia out of a market that they weren't interested in to begin with. It might have been sending a message, it might have been more diplomatic and economic. I don't know. It's an avenue for further research that I find at least substantial and worthy of bringing up. I think I've mostly reached the end of everything that's really worth bringing up. There's a few extra bits and pieces, but I think that it can mostly just be covered by sharing the class notes. So I'm only about half an hour early, so I can start moving into a conclusion. Hopefully perhaps field some questions. So there are a few major takeaways that I always try to leave people with from this lecture. Some of those were from the first half of the lecture. I will reiterate them here, although you won't have the context and supporting statement for them. First, human intervention is universal in ecosystems. There has not been a primordial, untouched, unintervened stretch of land on the planet Earth for about 5,000 years. Everything about the ecology all across the world has been shaped by human intervention. I don't say that as a condemnation. I don't say that as a commendation. It's simply a rock-solid fact. The Mediterranean basin was explicitly terraformed because of human interest. It went from old-growth forest to shrublands because of deforestation. Those shrublands were explicitly shaped to improve and optimize agricultural output, as well as pastoral and botany. The bees were part of it. Another important takeaway are these 4 words 4 words, you will be able to keep in mind the cardinal kind of circular, cyclical, apicultural tradition in its honey, if it wasn't consumed, would eventually south. Wax, if it wasn't consumed, would eventually find its way to the north. That's the trade winds. That was just the way that the pressures of demand pulled products from one to the other. Third, I fear at this point that this touches everything. Religion, it touches on economics, it touches philosophy, it touches the world, it touches ecology. If we in the SC want to be able to accurately or at least faithfully represent the, we need to think about apiculture more. If we want to be able to present or even just have a more complete understanding of the medieval world, not just focus on the horses and the cows. The bees have to be there too. Smallholders were the primary producers across the board. If you could specialize and become a mass producer, that was your ticket to a middle class. People lost their hands. So I encourage you all to think more often of the bee. Think about how apiculture impacts your persona. Think about its place in your time and think about if you don't know someone who is engaged in this, how did you contribute indirectly to you? And I leave you all with an injunction from one of the queens of Castile, who spoke to her at the beginning of a new session and requested of them all harmony and unity, and to be as the. Thank you. How will you feel then?
Discussed, I don't think, but was there much filtration? Any kind of treatment of, like, there were different grade classifications, but
Nothing in my research has talked at all about any kind of processing. If the honey was always taken raw, or if something was done to it before it was traded on.
It's really easier just to sell it.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to do it to produce fraud.
fair. Too, like, I wonder if some of the wax could be purified by melting.
So
Wax, wax you have to or you can make candles out of it.
yeah.
Fair. Fall under the chandlers though, or I don't know.
I don't know. I don't
All right.
know when the processing would have happened. At the point of production, or just before the point of product. I'd have to look into that.
Well, I missed most of the first head. But as a beekeeper myself, I've done a little bit of research, and at least in Western Europe, bees were kept in skeps.
Yes.
Skeps.
Yes.
To get the honey and the wax out.
Mm-hmm.
After that, you had to process the wax to get the other stuff out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Find, if you're looking to buy beeswax, you'll find gradations where the most expensive, the highest gradation is the white wax, because it comes, it's very pure, it burns quite well, and then the lower gradations come from lower in the hive, as was explained to me by a beekeeper at Penzic who took the class. That's where you're going to have bees that are really tracking dirt, dust, grit, grime, loose. wings getting caught and whatnot. So getting lower grade wax, you'll probably end up with pollutants, both in the form of dirt or insect parts that you could refine it and work it out. But, you're buying the cheap stuff, so you're skipping on.
Very difficult to transport. It's liquid, it's heavy, but how does say transporting water? I don't know. Is it much more dense?
Significantly heavier. But I told transporting honey specifically in a military context. And could be considered worth it to march with. Honey as a ration. But people, commercial purposes, people would haul it anywhere because they knew they could find a profit. Not so much over long distances. We don't have much record in my research for routes. Once you're going past your local region, you would generally be going on.
Understand if they were, well, again, the trade routes internally to East Antium was honey went, again, like you said, honey went.
Yeah. The most land routes in Eastern Europe, specifically because the product there was, there wasn't a lot of demand for East European wax further afield. So if you produced wax in, I don't know, modern day Lithuania or Belarus, then there might be enough motive south as, say, Greece.
Well, and it's easier because it's all river traffic.
Yeah.
Road traffic.
Mm-hmm. Research Sapojnik does not address river traffic very much. She mentions some studies on river traffic in the Roman countryside, but she doesn't anywhere else.
That's what the trip. Byzantium and Germany and most countries.
And that's probably just a factor of the documentation.
Yeah. Everything needs a port gets written down somewhere, unless you're a successful smuggler.
Right.
May not have had quite as much. There's not a central point where you point where more people get on than other points, but it may not necessarily jotting. It really warrants further research.
I would love to see a bit more of a dive into what using the honey for, sort of that huge, vast amount schedule, sort of at random intervals. I think you're onto something with it being used in conjunction with warfare for treating injuries, treating the wounded, making for folks who couldn't consume much of anything else at the time while they're recovering. It's probably some interesting things worth digging into that. But
For now, please sign the record if you are interested in receiving notes, which are the closest thing to a handout that I have. Please leave it. If not, then sign anyway, so that I have a souvenir of our time together.
okay. And with that, I think very much.
My
This
pleasure.
has been fascinating.